The Premier League is in crisis and breaking down as we speak with the unbelievable announcement that Manchester City and their lawyers have won their court case against the Premier League, as an independent panel has voted in favour of their assertion that APT rules, associated party transaction rules, are null and void, they are unlawful, and the fallout from this is massive. There are more decisions yet to fall with regards to the changes and the pivots to what was initially voted in November, with regards pivots away from interest-free loans from shareholders and other minor changes, but everything is up in the air as it's only 24 hours since the intended PSR rules that were going to pivot to the squad cost ratios were essentially shelved for the time being, and the continuation of profit and sustainability is going to continue. We've got an article from the Daily Mail that is just breaking for us. We've got it all to go through, and there's a lot of repercussions here. If you are a fan of Manchester City and Newcastle, you're probably very excited right now. Chelsea, Aston Villa, the cabal of dissidents that have seemingly found the legal loopholes in which to jump through. And once again, as I've been calling for and calling out for the last 2 years, the Premier League show their absolute ineptitude at creating a level playing field, their absolute inability to create laws and rules that do not have as many holes in it as my kitchen sieve. Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy this sort of football finance content, I know it's not for everyone, but it is a massive influential part of the game. And the more that you know is the more that you know. We're going to go through it and see what we know so far. If you do enjoy this sort of content, then smash the like button. If you haven't already, then hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section on what exactly is going on. And we are going to start. This is quite a long article from the Daily Mail, but bear with me and I will chew through it as best I can with you as we go through. This is one of my kind of pet projects, if you like, as a Tottenham fan and a content creator. Let's see what exactly is going on. Have I got the right screen up? I'm not sure I have. How about that one? No, let's go back to that one and we'll see where we're at. Okay, so here we go. The Premier League is in crisis as they lose the legal battle with Manchester City over unlawful sponsorship rules, and the verdict could have serious consequences for all clubs. Manchester City challenged the Premier League's rules on sponsorship deals in 2023. The rules were introduced after the Saudi-led takeover of Newcastle United. And let's get into it. The Premier League has suffered a significant setback after a tribunal deemed its sponsorship rules, which operated for almost 3 years, null and void, in a bombshell verdict that could now trigger a series of giant compensation claims and plunge the competition into crisis. An independent panel has sided with champions Manchester City and deemed that the league's associated party transaction regulations, which ran from December 21 until November 2024, were unlawful in their entirety. After proposed deals with Etihad Airways and the First Abu Dhabi Bank were blocked in 2023, City took the Premier League to court, effectively declaring war. They claimed that the league's APT rules around commercial deals clubs do with parties linked to them were unlawful. Now, a lot of people were speculating that part of the reason why Manchester City always seemingly appealing every verdict against them is and was in some part aligned to this notion that the more that you can tie up the Premier League's lawmakers and the lawyers that represent them in the courts, then the longer the delay will be in the 115 charges. I mean, most people kind of scoffed at the notion that there was any legitimacy to the challenges on a legal basis. But it turns out that they had allegedly well, not even allegedly, lawfully now, they had every single reason to do so. Let's continue. In September last year, a tribunal agreed with City, highlighting 3 elements which it deemed unlawful. One was the fact that shareholder loans, where parties with stakes in clubs such as Arsenal or Liverpool often lend money at low or no interest, were not subject to the same fair market value tests included in the APT rules. If you have seen plenty of videos on my channel, on Sean Butler TV, or on Football Inc., or in fact on the Spurs Talk Show, then you'll know that I do actually agree with them. I did then, I still do now, that what's good for the goose has to be good for the gander. How it is that companies and organizations and football clubs can source their revenue streams outside of footballing operations has to be fair and equal. And if you have an owner that is more than willing to be able to essentially utilize the revenue streams of a secondary, a tertiary part of their business, and want and see that there is a logical motivation to have a brand sponsoring a stadium, in the case of the Etihad deal, that happens to be a B2C facing business, in the case of naming rights, for example, then they have every reason to see value, as long as it's not massively inflated above market value. That, I think, is fair. But at the same time, you should make the argument that if you have a very wealthy owner who doesn't necessarily have the ability to find businesses within their pie or their portfolio of investments that do have that kind of necessary relationship with a business to consumer facing experience that happens to also be of a global brand, then there's other ways in which they can sort of raise revenue. And one of those was obviously through loans. And if you can get away with doing that because the ambitions of that owner is such that they're happy to not charge interest against the loans, then that also, to me, is unfair and creates uneven and unequal playing fields, of which I have a massive problem. Remember, guys, I say this all the time. If you're watching this, you won't be hearing this for the first time if you're familiar with me, but 92% of all trophies won in the last 25 years have been won by 5 trophies. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, 75% of all trophies in the last 12 years have been won by just 2. And so, I think that the Premier League is boring, and I think that the inability for the Premier League to make these rules stick and be without the ability for the smartest guys in the room, which are the lawyers of the clubs, to be able to find the endless amounts of loopholes. Jonny and I last year found about 10 loopholes within the current rules of FAP at the time, and one of them was explored and exploited within 48 hours of us talking about it. And if we can think of those things, then you best believe that the smartest minds in the room have got 100 more up their sleeve. On that basis, I will pivot towards the end of the story, towards the currently shelved but likely to be implemented anchoring rule, as there is an absolutely gaping wide loophole that is available to be exploited in that. Save that for the end. We'll come back to it. Let's continue with the story. In September last year, a tribunal agreed with City, highlighting 3 elements. Sorry, we got to that bit. At the time, a row erupted between City and the Premier League, with the latter claiming that a number of tweaks to the rules would suffice. Chief Executive Richard Masters claimed the tribunal had actually endorsed the APT rules and added it had only found a certain discrete elements that need to be amended. But in a blistering response to clubs, City legal counsel Simon Cliff warned against making hasty amendments and urged those involved to delay any further action until the tribunal had returned a further verdict on whether their previous rulings meant the whole system rather than certain sections were unlawful. Remember, Aswari, the Aston Villa CEO, the wealthiest man, I believe, in Egypt and therefore probably Africa, I'm not sure if that's a fair statement, who is one of the owners of Aston Villa, he said at the time that if the Premier League take Manchester City to court on this notion, you better believe, even if they are found guilty, that there will be further delays, further legal litigation, and that City would probably, in all likelihood, have some success. And was he talking from a place of prescience? Was he talking from a place of knowledge of what the intentions were? Well, it turned out after the fact that there's a lot of back scratching going on between those 3 or 4 clubs that currently have taken over the sort of dissidents, the cabal, I call them, of FFP dismissiveness. But look, it seems like things are moving in their direction. Let's continue with the article. Their view was that the ruling meant that the entire setup was null and void. City also took the seismic step of accusing the Premier League of attempting to mislead its members on the severity of the situation and raise the threat of further legal action should they press ahead. As I say, Aston Villa's chairman did the same. Regardless, in November, clubs voted in amendments to APT rules by a majority of 16-4. Now, those rules were in the large part minor in their detail, minor tweaks here and there that I won't bore you with, kind of very technical jargon and legal jargon that's not really that meaningful in its output. But one major thing was the removal of the ability for clubs to be able to write off debt and to be able to essentially give loans by proxy of that notion, but give loans back to the clubs from the owners' pockets at 0 interest rate. So if you're going to use debt from a wealthy owner and place it on the club, then you have to charge market rates. And at the moment, because the base rate in the UK is about 4.25, I think it was 4.5, and now it's 4.25%. It's on the way down because of the ridiculous amount of money that's been washing around the system since COVID and since the war in Ukraine. global inflation price is insane. Just go and check your, your receipts from Tesco's or whatever. I'm sure I won't need to convince you of that. But ultimately, if the base rate is 4.25%, then in commercial terms, the likelihood is that a fair, reasonable market rate would probably be somewhere in the region of 7% or higher. And obviously, if you have a very ambitious owner, then it's unlikely that they're going to charge extortionate rates. Although, that being said, it's up in the air right now until maybe today when this rule came out, that ultimately, or this legal justification came out, that maybe teams like Newcastle, who until now have had a little bit of a frustration, I think, with regards to their ownership in the inability to commit to funding their own stadium rebuild via the PIF's funds, and that they would have to charge hefty interest rates, and as I say, at hefty percentage points when you're talking about $1.5 billion, that can add up and eat into the club's ability to spend money, which is part of the reason potentially why Newcastle fans, as I say, are rightly and slightly maybe a little bit kind of curious as to why it is that they haven't had the game changer that they thought they were going to have from the PIF fund and the Saudi owners. But anyway, after this particular announcement today, and the fact that the entire APT system, including the rules changes in November, all of it might be up in the air. All of it might be completely whitewashed. And that therefore leaves you in a system and a situation whereby the wealthiest owners with the most ambition and the deepest pockets can essentially now therefore do what they want. They can charge what they want from their sister companies within their portfolio of investments. So Etihad could sponsor, if this turns out to be true, and there's no more legal challenges from the other way, appeals against the appeals, if you like, then you might see a situation whereby the Etihad Airlines can now sponsor that stadium, at twice the current rates because APT rules have been deemed unlawful. Similarly, wealthy owners that have more money in the ground than has ever been printed, like the Saudis, they may indeed fund the club without the need of putting debt onto the books. And that, again, can open up a whole world of, for me, competitive imbalance, whereby it's a race to the bottom. And that is a reason why, as a Tottenham fan who is very sympathetic to the plight of people who are frustrated with Daniel Levy for working within the rules and that are now pushing towards this movement of Levy out, ENIC out. Well, look, as I've been saying for a long time, whilst I can empathize and get on board with that notion that you're frustrated with our owner in terms of output on the pitch, with these sorts of rules, with these sorts of unwindings of intended levelers of the playing field, despite all of the problems that I have with them, it's an imperfect science, the removal of them essentially is going to put nails in the coffin of any of the fans who hope to have success if you're competing in a world where the current dissidents of these rules are going to be able to spend whatever they want or loan as much money without any interest rates as the APT rules look like they're going to be dismissed. It is quite scary, and it's a massive, massive news. I do want to get your thoughts. Let me know. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and drop the notification bell in the comment section as well. Let me know. Let's continue. Now, in a verdict which underlines City's position and which may have serious ramifications for the Premier League, the panel featuring legal experts Christopher Vajda, KC, Lord Dyson, that man is a Hoover, and Sir Nigel Tier has returned its final verdict, ruling that the APT regulations were unlawful in their entirety. That means that any deals that were rejected or reduced in value under the new system, which operated from 2021 to 2024, could now be subject to hefty compensation claims. It gets worse for the Premier League, for the lawmakers. Not only are all of that work, all of that effort, all of the attempts, as I say, with regards, even though they're imperfect, with regards to try to make things fairer, to try to create sustainability measures, all of those things, not only will they be unwound and allow these teams to carry on, or to return to the halcyon days, maybe if you're a City and Newcastle fan, Chelsea fan, where you could do and spend profligate money as long as you had an owner that didn't mind about that stuff. But on top of that, they may be due hefty compensation for the impact of the deals that were previously rejected and deemed unlawful. If a club believes its competitive performance was harmed, competitive performance harmed by a decision made under the previous APT system, it could sue. What are we doing here, people? What are we doing? City have also launched a legal challenge against the amended rules voted through in November. The same panel is due to rule on their legality in the near future. Should they deem those unlawful, the league could be thrown into chaos. None of the above is linked to the 115 charges levelled at City by the Premier League over alleged breaches of financial rules. While that case has been heard, a verdict remains outstanding. Let's be entirely honest here. At this stage, with the amount of money that Manchester City spent in January, with the fact that they appear incredibly confident with the amount of time that they put on an Erling Haaland contract, do we really suspect that Haaland's going to commit to a team unless he has been reassured by his club that all of those things are going away. And what we've seen over the last few days with regards to the parking of the squad cost ratio rules, this legal ramification today, obviously the future potential unwinding of the November changes with regards to the percentage, the inability for owners now to loan money at debt-free rates, all of that stuff up in the air. I think when you include and combine that with the reality of what Manchester City did in January, I think it's fair to say that in all likelihood, Manchester City are not going to be facing or staring down the barrel of significant losses and significant points deductions. Because I would imagine that just like we're seeing in every other walk of this volatile story, that the smartest minds in the room are not on the side of the Premier League. They are on the side of the people who want to obfuscate the legal situation and to dance through the doors that are wide open for them to do so. Let's continue. In a further blow, which is unlikely to go down well across the competition, the Premier League may now have to foot not only its own legal bill, but also Manchester City's. The figure of both combined is thought to be close to £20 million. Premier League Chief Executive Richard Masters made clubs aware of the situation in an email this afternoon. In it, he acknowledged that the previous rules, as a while, are void and unenforceable, but attempted to play down the developments. The previous APT rules are no longer in place, and new rules were voted into force. But the new rules only maneuvered a few technical details and added an additional law that if the first law was completely deemed to be unlawful in the first place, then the second law that was only introduced as a consequence of the first law being considered by people to be unfair, unless the other side is also clamped down upon. Well, if the former doesn't exist anymore, then why would the latter? So I think Richard Masters is playing a little bit of, covering his tracks here, kicking the can down the road to the ultimate scenario, which in all likelihood looks like both will be kicked out. And as I say, then owners are free to loan money at low to or zero interest rates. And companies that have a need, a will, a desire, etc., and a relevant value proposition can sponsor their own owners' secondary assets, i.e. the football clubs, for whatever price they want. At that point, the whole PSR thing, which is, like I say, the FFP, the squad cost ratios, that's been parked anyway. But the current rules of £105 million losses is still in place. If you do participate in Europe, you still have to abide by the 70% thresholds regarding your own squad costs and the combination of transfer fees that are amortized, your agent's fees and your player wages and your coaching wages. All of that stuff might be seemingly, at least at the moment, protected. But in terms of the £105 million loss rule, around 3 years, £35 million a year, well, that's largely irrelevant as well if you can now write checks of any size that you want for deals that other areas of your owner's interests overlap into. So, not that Manchester City or Newcastle were ever really going to probably face £105 million loss thresholds. Maybe Newcastle United might have done. I think they came close to PSR the year before last. But ultimately now the whole thing is worthless. The rules are worthless. The attempts to try to create a set of rules have been futile, inept, inadequate, and embarrassing. And as I say, once again, guys, if you're watching this as a Tottenham fan, this is why I feel the way that I do. It doesn't matter who you have in as owner, unless you have someone who looks an incredibly a lot like some of the other owners that are out there, of which there aren't that many left. Maybe Kuwait. But other than that, it is incredibly difficult to see how any of these outcomes result in anything other than in 5 years' time, I'll be saying it's not 90% of trophies going or 92% going to five directions. It's now 96%. It is what it is. I don't know. Maybe we have to shake hands with the notion of if you can't beat them, join them. Or maybe we should be wringing Daniel Levy's neck and saying, you know what? You under ENIC and under Tavistock have probably got plenty of assets that are B2C facing and therefore, participate in the same mechanisms. Participate in them. It's the only way you can compete. If not him, then someone else. But either way, I just think the whole thing is a joke. I think it's an absolute disgrace. And the Premier League should hang their heads in shame because they are not fit for purpose. In any other walk of life, you would be frog marched away from your desk and sent away as a disgrace to the organization in which you are employed to, and paid a lot of money to ensure that a lot of people, millions around the world, have at least some level of optimism and hope that their team may be able to win something. And at the moment, it doesn't look like that's ever going to change. The previous ATP rules are no longer in place, he said. The APT rules were brought in following the Saudi-led takeover of Newcastle United amid concerns from other clubs. They were aimed at preventing inflated injections of cash into sides from companies linked to their owners, often based in the same country, in an attempt to navigate wider financial rules to allow them to spend big on players and wages. City, whose case was led by Paul Harris and Lord Panic. Nobody panic! City weren't panicked, were they? Let's be honest. Of Freshfields will see the verdict as an entire vindication of their stance throughout the entire process. Fair play to them. The 18-page final award seen by Mail Sports states in the first partial final award, it was declared that the APT rules and amended APT rules were unlawful in 3 respects. There now arises for decision the question whether those 3 respects can be severed from the remaining APT rules so that those remaining APT rules are valid and enforceable. The 3 respects in which the APT rules and amended APT rules were unlawful cannot be severed, with the result that the APT rules as a whole are void and unenforceable. Attention will now shift to the latest legal challenge. Should the tribunal again find in City's favour, it may well allow the likes of City and Newcastle to strike significantly higher agreements with current sponsors. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the history there. It's a bit of a summary, but in a nutshell, as I say, the rules that were implemented in November essentially stopped there being in the eyes of Manchester City an imbalance whereby owners who have third-party companies who want to be able to sponsor those things because there's a value proposition. Etihad, right, a global brand that is B2C, so there's value to them having their stadium naming rights. The question marks is what is the correct valuation? APT rules would try to put that into fair market value. The November rules were tweaking just what that fair market value calculation looks like, and it's a technical mathematical thing, and it's really not that interesting. But the other major thing was Manchester City said, well, if you're going to do that, even though I think it's unlawful and we're going to see you in court about it, then you have to hold the same level of energy towards owners who don't necessarily do it via APT, but just want to loan money at 0 or very low interest rates. And they agreed. And in November, 16 clubs voted in favor of saying that if you're going to loan money to your own business, to your own football club, then you have to charge market rates of interest that are reasonable, as I said earlier, which are probably right now, given the 4.5% base rate, is somewhere like 7, 8, 9% or higher, depending on what sort of owner you have and how you want to shape it or structure it. Turns out that in all likelihood, both are going to be removed. And therefore, as I said, PSR, FFP, in terms of the Premier League, it's up in the air. It looks like it's a one-way street towards a removal of all of it. And we have to go back to the drawing board. And as I say, guys, the last thing I'll say, I mentioned at the start that there is a never-ending list of loopholes that you can jump through, right? And that's why there's always these amendments and tweaks, because as soon as the rules are put in place, the smartest minds in the room are figuring out how to get around them. And they did. Chelsea were selling a hotel to a third party and then leasing it back. So you got all of the money on the book for the sale, but then you could still use the hotel and take the revenues into the system as well. Loophole shouldn't have existed, did. Jonny and I called out situations whereby players could, of say Chelsea or Aston Villa and Newcastle, teams that are within that cabal, could essentially value the player at 5, 6, 10, 100 times, whatever, the fair market valuation of the player, because APT rules did not apply to player trading assets. And then if the players come through the youth system, then obviously you can receive the money for the sale of your player immediately. And if you're doing a swapsies with another team that you're in cahoots with, they can do exactly the same thing. So basically, if 2 players are worth £10 million, they've come through the youth systems of the 2 clubs, you can value them at 50. I buy yours for 50, and then you get the 50 million on, and then I can amortize the 50 over the length of the contract, which is at 6 years. And at the same time, they can buy my player for 50 and do exactly the same thing. And then in terms of ability to spend, you have £50 million extra. In terms of net actual money transitions, it's exactly the same as if they were transferred at 10 million, the real market valuation. And Jonny and I talked about this last summer, and then 2 days later, that it's exactly the same thing happened. Anchoring is another thing that was going to be going to be brought in. Anchoring is a rule that essentially says, in order to try to make an even more level playing field, then it doesn't matter what money you earn, you are limited to whatever the lower of the 2 options are, 70% or 85%, sorry, of your clubs' earnings can be spent on the combination of player trading, amortized spend, wages of your coaches and your players, and agents' fees. Or if this number is lower, then 5 times the revenue of the lowest revenue generating club. So in this particular league, even though this particular season it wouldn't have been in place, in a world where it was, I believe Ipswich is the lowest revenue generating club. And whatever that number is, I think it was about 100 million. Let's just use 100 million as an argument's sake, 100 million pound, just for argument's sake. If that number was then multiplied by 5, it would make 500 million pound. In a world where even if 85%, the other calculation, was higher than 500 million pound for a team like Manchester City, who's the highest revenue generating team in the Premier League, then they would be limited to 500 million pound. Another rule that they were not happy with. And I think under last season's numbers, they would have been the only club that would have been significantly harmed by that potential anchoring model. One of the obvious loopholes there, this is why, again, it hasn't been used yet because the rule hasn't been put in place. But if I was to work for Manchester City, this is the very first thing I would do. I would go to Ipswich Town, who I do not see as a threat in any way, shape or form in terms of my outcomes for the year. I would look for their very best player, maybe a Leif Davies, maybe some, whoever it might be, and say, or a young kid, even better, a young kid where you can still use that amortization versus the reception on the books immediately, and say, if the player's worth 10 million, I will give you 50 million pound for him. And in so doing, and by the way, I'll also even loan him back to you for 2 years, right? So you can keep the player. He becomes our asset. You get 50 million pound, and therefore your revenue jumps to 150 million pound, which when you put the 5 times multiplier on adds another 250 million pound to their ability to spend, which would then bump up Manchester City's threshold and allow them to do more business. Another just very easy example of why the rules are not fit for purpose. Whatever you do, whatever has been proposed, it takes 10 seconds to think of easy ways where intelligent minds in the legal and in the boardrooms of these clubs with the ability and the demand and the appetite to spend and take risks can dance through the rules. Masters, you are a joke. The Premier League, you are embarrassing. This is horrifying for every fan of football who really does want some level of competition. And it should be absolutely terrifying for every fan of any team that is probably not Newcastle, Manchester City, or state-backed, because essentially it's a race to the bottom, and the absence of any movement towards a securing of competitive balance means that you will see even less likelihood of your team lifting any trophies anytime soon. Let me know your thoughts, guys. Like, subscribe, and comment. And as always, bye-bye.